The rain fell in a relentless, chilling sheet over the winding backroads of Raleigh County, West Virginia. Inside the cab of the sheriff's truck, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers did little to cut the tension. Deputy Mark Markham, barely a year out of Charleston and still unaccustomed to the deep, oppressive silence of the mountains, gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. The truck's tires spun and caught on the slick mud and gravel of a path that wasn't on any official map. Beside him, Sheriff Dale Cobb, a man who seemed carved from the very mountains he patrolled, let out a weary sigh. "Welfare check," he grumbled, his voice a low drawl that was as thick as the surrounding fog. Tip came into the DHHR line. "Anonymous. Said we needed to check on the Barlows. We're probably wasting gas, Mark. They've been up here for generations. Never heard a soul 'cause they never see a soul." As they crested a final, muddy rise, the woods opened into a clearing that seemed to suck the very light from the sky. Before them lay a grim tableau of human existence at its most desperate edge. A collection of dilapidated shacks and trailers, patched together with rusted scrap metal and warped, rotting planks of wood, huddled under the weeping gray sky. Thin plumes of acrid smoke curled from a crooked stovepipe. The moment the engine idled, a chorus of vicious, frantic barking erupted from a pack of skeletal-looking dogs straining against heavy chains. But it was the smell that hit them next, an invasive stench that slithered through the truck's vents, a thick, cloying mixture of damp earth, human waste, wood smoke, and something else, a sickly sweet undertone of decay that turned the stomach. Sheriff Cobb's folksy boredom vanished, replaced by a hard, grim line on his face. This wasn't just isolation, it was something else entirely. The door of the main shack creaked open, and a figure emerged, moving with a strange, shuffling gait. It was a man, though his age was impossible to guess. He could have been 30 or 60. His frame was tall and gaunt, his clothes little more than filthy rags hanging from his bony shoulders. His eyes, wide and a pale, washed-out blue, were completely unfocused, staring through the deputies as if they were ghosts. He stopped at the edge of the muddy porch, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. Markham rolled his window down a crack, ready to announce their presence, but before he could speak, the man opened his mouth. No words came out. Instead, a sound echoed across the clearing, a low, guttural, clicking grunt, a noise that was more animal than human. It was a sound of profound and disturbing emptiness, and in that moment, the simple welfare check became a descent into a nightmare. What had happened to this family, hidden from the world for so long? The official report began not with a bang, but with a whisper. In a drab, fluorescent-lit office in the Raleigh County DHHR building, Sarah Jenkins listened to the recorded hotline call for the third time. The caller was a cashier from a Dollar General 30 miles away, her voice shaky. She described a woman, gaunt and terrified, who paid for canned goods and bandages with old, musty-smelling bills. A woman who leaned in close, her breath smelling of rot, and uttered a single, desperate word: "Help." That was it. No name, no details, just that one raw, elemental plea. Sarah, barely 6 months into her transfer from Morgantown, felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She was used to complex cases, but this was different. It was a ghost story, a single word echoing from the dark hollows of the county, and according to West Virginia's mandatory reporting statutes, it was a sound she was legally and morally obligated to answer. She looked up the scant property records for the area mentioned, finding only one name: Barlow. Getting Sheriff Dale Cobb to escort her was a challenge in itself. He met her request with a weary sigh, his expression making it clear he viewed this as a fool's errand prompted by a city girl who didn't understand the local customs. "Miss Jenkins," he drawled as his truck bounced along the rutted, unpaved road, "there are folks out here who live by a different clock. The Barlows, they're not on our time. They're not on anyone's. My granddaddy told me stories about them. They keep to themselves, and everyone else keeps away from them. It's an arrangement that's worked for the better part of a century." Sarah gripped her case file, the single sheet of paper with the word "help" typed on it, feeling flimsy against the weight of his skepticism. An arrangement doesn't supersede a potential child endangerment or vulnerable adult abuse call, Sheriff, she stated, her voice tighter than she intended. The law doesn't stop where the pavement ends. Cobb just grunted, his eyes fixed on the muddy track ahead as the woods closed in around them. They didn't even make it to the collection of shacks. The path was blocked by a crude gate of logs and rusted barbed wire, a clear and unambiguous message. As the truck idled, two men emerged from the tree line, moving with a silent, predatory confidence. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in layers of stained, mismatched clothing. Their faces were grimy, their expressions hard and unreadable. They stopped 20 feet from the truck, planting themselves in the middle of the road, a human wall. Sheriff Cobb rolled down his window, the practiced, folksy charm of a rural lawman ready. "Afternoon, boys," Sheriff Cobb. "We're just here on a routine welfare check. Need to have a quick word with a Martha Barlow." The taller of the two men, his hair long and matted, simply shook his head. "Ain't no one by that name here," he said, his voice a low, flat rumble. "This is private land. You need to turn around and leave." There was no negotiation in his tone, only a final, unyielding command. Sarah leaned across the seat. "Sir, we received a call expressing concern. Under state law, we're required to make visual contact to ensure her safety. It will only take a moment." The second man, who had been silent until now, took a step forward, his eyes locking onto hers. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and utterly devoid of emotion. He spat a thick stream of tobacco juice into the mud near the truck's tire. "You ain't required to do nothing on this land. The only law here is our law. Now get." The threat was palpable, hanging in the damp air. Sheriff Cobb held up a hand, a sign for Sarah to back down. They were at a legal and physical impasse. Without a warrant, they had no authority to force their way past the gate, and these men looked more than willing to meet force with force. As Cobb slowly reversed the truck, Sarah watched the two figures in her side mirror until the woods swallowed them again. The stone wall they had just hit was more than just suspicion, it was proof. Someone on that property had absolute control, and they would do anything to keep the outside world away. Back in the sterile confines of her office, the memory of the two men at the gate played on a loop in Sarah Jenkins's mind. The raw, primal hostility was a far more compelling report than anything she could type. Frustration gave way to a cold, methodical resolve. If the Barlows had built a physical wall, she would dismantle their digital one. For hours, she hunched over her state-issued computer, the glow of the monitor illuminating her determined face. She cross-referenced the name, Barlow, in Raleigh County with every database she could access: Social Security records, DMV registrations, voter rolls, and public assistance files. The results were unnerving. Jedediah Barlow, age 78, had a Social Security number and a driver's license that expired in 1988. His wife, Martha, appeared on the 1970 census and then vanished. Beyond them, there was nothing. No birth certificates, no school records, no digital footprint for the two men at the gate or for any children who might be living on that land. It was as if an entire generation had been born and raised without ever officially existing. Sheriff Cobb, for his part, had shed his earlier skepticism. The flat, dead-eyed stare of the second man at the gate had been enough to convince him that this was more than just a family wanting their privacy. Back at his own desk, surrounded by the familiar clutter of case files and coffee cups, he ran the name Elias Barlow, a name he'd dredged up from an old poaching citation from 15 years prior that matched the description of the taller man. The file was thin, but it was a start. He sent a formal request to the West Virginia State Police for any and all information connected to the Barlow property, citing obstruction of a welfare check. He then pulled up the county's aerial survey maps, comparing the most recent images with ones from a decade ago. The clearing had grown, and two new, ramshackle structures had appeared. They weren't just living off the grid, they were expanding their isolated kingdom, deeper in the shadows of the mountains. The silence from that holler was no longer the quiet of peaceful isolation, it was the sound of something being actively and aggressively hidden from view. Recognizing she was at the limits of her local resources, Sarah made a calculated decision to escalate. She spent an entire afternoon drafting a formal request for assistance, not just to the state police, but to the FBI's Charleston field office. She framed her argument carefully, moving beyond a simple welfare check. Citing the U.S. Census Bureau's own reports on hard-to-count populations, she argued that the Barlow compound represented a potential case of systemic deprivation of civil rights, where individuals were being deliberately kept unregistered and uncounted, making them invisible to the state and federal government. She detailed the complete lack of records for any person under the age of 50, the aggressive obstruction of her legally mandated visit, and the whispered plea for help that had started it all. She wasn't just asking for help finding a missing woman anymore, she was suggesting the existence of a ghost population, a hidden community living under a state of absolute, unlawful control. The request landed on the desk of Agent Miller, an FBI analyst specializing in domestic extremism and unusual populations. Initially, it looked like another rural jurisdiction dispute, something to be passed back to the state. But the specifics in Sarah's report were too precise to ignore. Miller pulled high-resolution satellite imagery from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency archives, going back 20 years. He saw the compound's slow, organic growth, like a mold spreading in the dark. He ran a sophisticated query through the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, and the Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMUS, searching for any Jane Doe or missing person report that could be tangentially linked to Raleigh County or the Barlow name. The results were a chilling void. No one had ever escaped the compound and been found. No one had ever reported a family member missing after they'd associated with the Barlows. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed system, a black hole on the map that swallowed people whole, leaving no trace for the outside world to follow. While the federal gears began to slowly turn, Sarah knew from experience that the fastest answers often lay buried in paper, not on servers. She drove to the Raleigh County Courthouse, its marble floors and dark wood paneling a stark contrast to the mud and decay of the Barlow property. In the musty archives of the records room, she began the painstaking process of pulling every physical deed, tax record, and court filing associated with that parcel of land since it was first deeded in the early 1900s. For 2 days, she sifted through brittle, yellowed paper, the smell of dust and time filling her lungs. And then she found it. A civil suit from 1972. The plaintiff was Lydia Barlow, and the defendant was her brother, Jedediah Barlow. The suit contested the ownership of the family land, with Lydia claiming Jedediah had seized it illegally. But just a few months after it was filed, the case was abruptly withdrawn. After that date, Lydia Barlow's name vanished from every public record in West Virginia. This was it. This was the first crack in the wall, a name, a conflict, and a potential witness who had seen the darkness begin. The discovery of the 1972 lawsuit felt like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for half a century. Sarah Jenkins, her hands stained with the dust of old records, rushed back to the sheriff's department, the brittle court documents protected in a manila folder. She laid them on Sheriff Cobb's cluttered desk, her voice buzzing with an energy he hadn't seen in her before. "This is it, Sheriff. This is our probable cause. A documented, hostile takeover of the family land by Jedediah, followed by the complete disappearance of his sister, Lydia. This isn't just a family that likes its privacy. This is a pattern of behavior that started 50 years ago." Cobb picked up the thin file, his brow furrowed as he read. He looked up, his expression not one of excitement, but of weary pragmatism. "Sarah, this is a withdrawn civil suit from before you were born. I can walk this over to Judge Patterson right now, and he'll laugh me out of his chambers. He'll say it's old family squabbling. It's a piece of the puzzle, I grant you that. But it's not enough to kick in a door. We need something fresher, something that connects this old ghost story to that woman who whispered for help last week." Unwilling to accept his reluctance as the final word, Sarah spent the next morning preparing a formal warrant request herself. She bypassed the sheriff and went directly to the Raleigh County Prosecutor's office, securing a meeting with Assistant District Attorney Frank Henderson, a man known for his rigid adherence to prosecutorial standards. In his sterile, organized office, she laid out her case with methodical precision. She connected the dots from the anonymous tip, to the armed men at the gate, to the total lack of vital records for an entire generation, and culminating in the 1972 lawsuit and Lydia Barlow's subsequent vanishing act. "It's a pattern of coercive control and isolation," she argued, her voice firm. "We have a legal and moral obligation to see what's behind that gate." Henderson listened patiently, his fingers steepled. When she finished, he gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. "Ms. Jenkins, what you have is a compelling theory. What you don't have is evidence of a crime. Without a credible witness to a recent felony or physical evidence, no judge will sign this. It's a fishing expedition. My hands are tied. The Fourth Amendment is clear. We can't suspend it based on a hunch, no matter how strong that hunch is." Defeated, Sarah returned to her own office, the weight of the institutional stone wall pressing down on her. The victory she felt in the courthouse archives now tasted like ash. An hour later, Sheriff Cobb appeared in her doorway, his face grim. He was holding a fax, the paper still warm. "While you were talking to the lawyers," he began, his voice low, "I was doing some digging of my own. I sent a request to the Social Security Administration to trace Lydia Barlow's payments. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could find her." He slid the paper onto her desk. It was an official death certificate from the Ohio Department of Health. Lydia Barlow had passed away 2 years prior in a state-run nursing facility in Ashtabula County. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, her age as 89. She had died alone, with no next of kin listed. The one voice that could have bridged the 50-year gap, the one person who could have testified to what Jedediah had done, was gone forever. The trail had gone cold, and the secrets of the Barlow compound were once again locked away, seemingly beyond their reach. The news of Lydia Barlow's death hung in the air of Sarah Jenkins's office like a physical weight, crushing the fragile momentum they had built. The one person who could have given them a first-hand account, who could have bridged the 50-year gap of silence, was gone. Sheriff Cobb sank into the visitor's chair opposite her desk, the fax with the death certificate lying between them like a tombstone. "That's it, then," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual drawl. "The trail ends in a nursing home in Ohio. Henderson was right. Without a living witness, we've got nothing but a ghost story and a strong hunch." For a moment, Sarah felt a profound sense of defeat. The system she had put her faith in, the laws, the procedures, had failed. The wall around the Barlow compound seemed higher and more impenetrable than ever. Just as she was about to concede, her desk phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the gloom. It was Agent Miller from the FBI's Charleston office, his voice a calm, professional counterpoint to their despair. He was just calling to follow up, but his timing would prove to be the pivot upon which the entire case would turn. Agent Miller listened patiently as Sarah recounted the dead end they had hit with Lydia Barlow's death certificate. When she finished, there was a brief pause on the line. "That's a setback," Miller conceded, "but it doesn't mean we're blind." He proceeded to explain that, following her initial report, he had gone beyond standard satellite reconnaissance. Suspecting that the Barlows were deliberately concealing their numbers, he had leveraged federal resources to task a National Reconnaissance Office satellite for a low-orbit thermal imaging pass over the property the previous night. He emailed the file as he spoke. Sarah opened it, her breath catching in her throat. The screen showed the clearing not in shades of gray, but in a ghostly palette of oranges, reds, and yellows. The 2 men at the gate were there, 2 bright signatures near the entrance. But inside the main shack and the 2 trailers, the screen glowed with a horrifying constellation of smaller, dimmer heat signatures. "We've counted them 3 times, Miller said. "There are at least 12, possibly 13, distinct human forms on that property. 7 of them appear to be child-sized." The thermal imaging data was a bombshell, providing the first concrete, visual evidence that the Barlows were hiding a substantial number of people. It transformed the case from a welfare check on a few recluses into a potential mass hostage or imprisonment scenario. The image burned itself into Sarah's mind, and with it, a detail from the very first tip-off call resurfaced with new significance. The cashier at the Dollar General had mentioned that the terrified woman, Martha, had paid with old, musty-smelling bills. At the time, it was a piece of atmospheric color, but now, it felt like a clue. Sarah pulled up the initial report and called the cashier back. With a mix of luck and the woman's own sense of unease about the transaction, she had set one of the $20 bills aside, tucking it into the store's petty cash box because it felt wrong. Sarah immediately coordinated with Sheriff Cobb, who dispatched a deputy to retrieve the bill. An hour later, it was on his desk, sealed in an evidence bag. It was a Series 1969 bill, worn soft with age but still crisp. It was a tangible piece of the past, a financial ghost from the exact time Jedediah had seized control of the land. The discovery of the old currency and the thermal imaging data created a surge of new energy. Sheriff Cobb, now fully invested, remembered a detail from Elias Barlow's 15-year-old poaching file. The arresting officer had confiscated not only the rifle but also the improperly tagged deer hide. It was a long shot, but he went down to the courthouse evidence lockup, a damp, cavernous basement filled with the forgotten artifacts of decades of county crime. After an hour of searching, he found it. A dusty box labeled with the old case number. Inside, the deer hide was still preserved. Cobb immediately called Agent Miller. "I might have something for your lab guys," he said. "We have a deer hide handled by Elias Barlow in 2004. Can you get DNA from that?" Miller confirmed it was possible. The hide was carefully packaged and sent via a state police courier to the FBI laboratory in Quantico. Forensic technicians were able to isolate human epithelial cells from the hide, develop a full DNA profile for Elias Barlow, and run it through the National DNA Index and, more importantly, public forensic genealogy databases. Less than 48 hours later, Agent Miller called back. "We got a hit," he said, his voice tight with excitement. The DNA profile for Elias Barlow had flagged a familial match in a public genealogy database. It wasn't a parent or a sibling, but a second cousin, a 72-year-old man named Robert Akers living in a small town in eastern Kentucky. He had submitted his DNA years ago to trace his family tree. Sheriff Cobb and Sarah Jenkins were in Cobb's truck and on the road within the hour. They found Robert Akers on his front porch, a retired coal miner with a sharp memory. When they mentioned the name Jedediah Barlow, his face darkened. He spoke of the family stories he'd heard his whole life, whispers about his mother's cousin, Jedediah, who had gone bad. He recounted the story of Jedediah's sister, Lydia, who had shown up on his parents' doorstep one night in 1972, terrified and bruised, claiming Jedediah had claimed the family for his own seed, and was building a kingdom of filth. She had stayed one night before fleeing to Ohio, begging them to never speak of her again. It was the corroboration they desperately needed, a living voice connecting the past to the present. The ghost story had just found its witness. The long drive back from Kentucky was a study in controlled electricity. The silence in Sheriff Cobb's truck was no longer one of weary uncertainty but of focused anticipation. Robert Akers' testimony, recorded on a digital voice recorder now sitting on the dashboard, was the linchpin they had been searching for. It was a living voice reaching across 50 years of darkness, corroborating the faded ink of the 1972 lawsuit and giving context to the hostile figures at the gate. Sarah Jenkins stared out at the rolling hills of Appalachia, the landscape no longer feeling like an impenetrable fortress but a crime scene they were finally about to access. With his sworn statement, Cobb said, breaking the quiet, his voice a low, determined rumble, "Henderson can't say no. Judge Patterson will have to sign it." They spent the next hour mapping out the strategy. Cobb would draft the warrant affidavit himself, a meticulous and damning narrative. Sarah would begin preparing the petitions for emergency state custody of 13 individuals, 7 of them children, who existed only as heat signatures and whispered family lore. The final, unavoidable confrontation was no longer a possibility, it was an imminent reality. They were less than an hour from Raleigh County when Cobb's cell phone rang, the screen displaying Robert Akers' Kentucky number. Cobb answered, putting it on speaker. Akers' voice was thin, strained with an emotion that hadn't been there in person. "Sheriff," he began, his breathing ragged, "after you left, I got to thinking. I went up to the attic. My mother, she kept everything. I was looking for an old photo of Lydia, to see her face again." There was a pause, and the sound of rustling paper. "I found her Bible, and inside was this." He cleared his throat. "It's a letter. From Lydia, dated November 1972. She sent it to my mother a month after she ran." Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. Akers continued, his voice cracking as he read a line from the brittle page. "He has taken Martha for his own. He calls it God's will, a holy union to keep the bloodline pure. She is with his child, and I fear for her soul." The truck filled with a sudden, profound cold. The original Martha, Jedediah's other sister, had been the first mother in this cursed lineage. The letter was the Rosetta Stone of the Barlow family's private hell. It wasn't just a story passed down through generations, it was a primary source document, a cry for help written in the immediate aftermath of the crime that started it all. The woman at the Dollar General, the one who had whispered for help, was likely Martha's daughter or granddaughter, a living legacy of that first, unholy union. The cycle wasn't a theory, it was a documented, 50-year pattern of rape and incest, justified by a twisted, self-serving theology. Sheriff Cobb pulled the truck over to the gravel shoulder, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He immediately called a contact with the Kentucky State Police, arranging for a trooper to drive to Akers' home, secure the letter as evidence, and meet them at the state line. Then, he dialed Assistant District Attorney Frank Henderson. There was no preamble, no pleading. "Frank," Cobb said, his voice stripped of all its folksy charm, leaving only cold, hard steel. "I have a witness to the original crime, and I have a letter from 1972 detailing the rape of a teenage girl by her brother, Jedediah Barlow. I'll have it on your desk in 2 hours. Get the warrant ready, we're going in." The warrant, signed by Judge Patterson less than an hour after Henderson received the call, was a formality. The real challenge began the moment the news broke. A clerk in the prosecutor's office, eager for a moment of self-importance, leaked the basics to a cousin who worked for a local Charleston TV station. By dusk, a single news van was parked outside the sheriff's department. The initial report was vague, a major multi-agency law enforcement operation targeting an isolated family compound in Raleigh County, but it was enough. The spark hit the dry tinder of local legend and media hunger. Sheriff Cobb's dispatch line, normally quiet, lit up with calls from national news desks in New York and Atlanta. The carefully planned, surgical operation was rapidly devolving into a public spectacle, and Cobb knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that the Barlows, secluded as they were, might not be deaf to the roar of the approaching world. By the next morning, the single news van had become a small army. Satellite trucks from every major cable network lined the main road into Beckley, their towering antennas a stark, modern intrusion against the ancient hills. The story had taken on a life of its own, a perfect storm of true crime intrigue and Appalachian Gothic horror. Reporters, parachuted in from cities, ambushed locals at gas stations and diners, paying for exaggerated tales of the mountain clan that had been the stuff of campfire stories for generations. The narrative was no longer about a welfare check, it was about a cursed family, a house of horrors, a lost tribe. This media frenzy placed unbearable pressure on the operation. Every decision was now subject to the scrutiny of a national audience, and the risk of a misstep, broadcast live for millions, had grown exponentially. The mission to save the Barlows was now also a mission to manage a circus. The national attention attracted more than just journalists. Following threads on social media, a volatile mix of anti-government activists and sovereign citizen sympathizers began to arrive. They saw the impending raid not as a rescue, but as a government assault on personal liberty, a state-sanctioned siege against a family choosing to live differently. They set up a makeshift camp near the police staging area, a chaotic collection of pickup trucks, RVs, and Gadsden flags. They used smartphones to live stream the movements of every police cruiser, their rhetoric growing more heated with each passing hour, accusing the authorities of tyranny. This introduced a dangerous and unpredictable variable. Sheriff Cobb was no longer just planning a raid on a hostile compound, he was managing a potential three-way confrontation between his officers, the barricaded Barlows, and a crowd of agitated civilians who saw him as the villain. The operation was now a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Inside the operational command post, set up in a borrowed fire hall several miles from the compound, the tension was a physical presence. The final briefing was conducted against the muffled background noise of news helicopters and protesters' chants. Maps of the Barlow property, annotated with thermal imaging data and tactical entry points, were laid out on folding tables. Agent Miller, now on site from Charleston, reviewed FBI protocols for hostage rescue, emphasizing the psychological state of the victims. The state police tactical commander detailed the rules of engagement, his voice grim. The plan had been complicated tenfold by the public exposure. They now had to assume the Barlows were aware and potentially prepared for a siege. Sarah Jenkins stood in the corner, her case file clutched in her hands. The single word, help, had led to this moment, a massive, complex, and perilous operation on the brink of launch, with the entire world watching. The pre-dawn raid began not with a shout, but with the quiet, methodical clicks of gear being checked and the crunch of tactical boots on damp earth. A thick West Virginia fog clung to the ground, muffling sound and turning the world a ghostly gray. The state police tactical team moved in a silent, disciplined formation, their movements a stark contrast to the chaotic squalor of the compound they were about to enter. The command was given through hand signals. A battering ram, held by two officers, splintered the flimsy door of the main shack with a single, explosive thud. Bodycam footage captures the disorienting rush inward. A blur of dark, cluttered space, the beam of a weapon-mounted flashlight cutting through the gloom, illuminating piles of refuse, stained mattresses, and the overwhelming evidence of profound neglect. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and decay, a smell so potent it was almost a physical force. Officers fanned out, their voices low and controlled as they cleared the first two rooms, finding them empty but for the debris of a ruined existence. The silence from within was more unnerving than any scream. The climax of the breach occurred in a windowless back room. As the team pushed open a crude plank door, their flashlights fell upon a scene of unimaginable human tragedy. Huddled together on a bare, filthy floor were nearly a dozen figures, their ages impossible to discern in the half-light. They were the mute generation. Their eyes, wide with a terror that seemed ancient and absolute, reflected the beams of light. They didn't scream or cry out. They whimpered, a chorus of low, guttural sounds and pained grunts that were the only language they had ever known. One officer, his voice cracking, knelt and gently lifted a thin, ragged blanket. Underneath was a small boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, his limbs rail-thin from malnutrition, his spine visibly twisted. The boy, Caleb, didn't flinch or recoil. He simply stared up with huge, vacant eyes, a soul lost in a prison of flesh and bone. At that moment, Sarah Jenkins entered the room behind the team. The professional mask she had worn for months shattered. A choked sob escaped her lips as her hand flew to her mouth, the raw, visceral horror of what she had fought so hard to uncover finally laid bare before her. While the main team secured the victims, a second unit breached the separate, smaller trailer that served as Jedediah Barlow's private quarters. Inside, the filth was less pronounced, replaced by a strange, Spartan order. Jedediah, 78 years old but still possessing a wiry strength, was sitting calmly in a wooden chair, a worn Bible open on his lap. He didn't seem surprised or afraid, only filled with a cold, righteous fury. As officers entered, he looked up, his pale blue eyes burning with an unholy conviction. "The serpent has come to my garden," he spat, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You have no dominion here. These are my children, my flock, protected from the filth of your world by the will of God Almighty." He continued to quote twisted, self-serving scripture as officers moved in, showing no remorse, no flicker of guilt. He offered no physical resistance, but his ideological defiance was absolute. As they pulled his arms behind his back and the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, his face remained a mask of messianic certainty, the unrepentant architect of a 50-year nightmare being led out of his fallen kingdom into the light. The legal proceedings that followed, officially titled *The State of West Virginia versus Jedediah Barlow*, became a national media sensation, a grotesque spectacle that played out on cable news networks for months. The trial was held in Charleston due to the intense local publicity, but the details that emerged felt as if they were being broadcast from another century. The prosecution, led by a stone-faced Frank Henderson, built an airtight case. They presented Lydia's haunting letter, Robert Akers' emotional testimony, and the damning DNA evidence from Quantico. But the most powerful evidence came from the medical experts. Doctors from Johns Hopkins University testified about the profound genetic abnormalities, the chronic malnutrition, and the severe developmental trauma inflicted upon every single victim. Throughout it all, Jedediah Barlow sat impassive, his eyes fixed on the jury, a portrait of unrepentant evil. He was found guilty on all counts, dozens of charges of rape, incest, and unlawful imprisonment, and was sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would die in a state penitentiary, a concrete box far from the mountain kingdom he had built on a foundation of human suffering. The fate of the 13 survivors was a far more complex and heartbreaking story, one that unfolded away from the glare of the courtroom cameras. Placed under the permanent guardianship of the state, they were moved to specialized long-term care facilities. The older victims, some in their 40s, were largely lost to the world. Their minds and bodies were so conditioned by decades of abuse and isolation that integration was impossible. They would live out their days in quiet, protected institutions, the echoes of their trauma too profound to overcome. For the children, however, there was a glimmer of hope. Therapists and special education teachers worked tirelessly, celebrating small victories that were, in reality, monumental leaps. Caleb, the boy found twisted and near death, took his first unassisted steps at the age of 7. And Martha, the woman whose single whispered word had shattered 50 years of silence, was shown in a quiet moment, her hand shaking but determined, as she slowly and deliberately wrote her own name for the very first time. A powerful act of reclaiming an identity that had been stolen from her before she was even born. The Barlow case left an indelible scar on the American psyche, a modern Gothic tale that forced a national conversation about the dark pockets of poverty and isolation that still exist, hidden in plain sight. In West Virginia, it triggered a sweeping overhaul of the Department of Health and Human Resources, with new protocols and funding allocated specifically to identify and engage with off-grid populations, ensuring that a welfare check would never again be dismissed as a waste of gas. The compound itself was eventually bulldozed, the shacks and trailers torn down and burned, an attempt to physically erase the stain on the land. But the story remains, a chilling reminder that the deepest horrors are not the work of ghosts or monsters, but of men, and that sometimes, the most desperate cries for help are the ones that are never spoken aloud. If this story has moved you, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the cases that shape our understanding of the human condition. And click here to watch our investigation into the Turpin family, a story that proves these houses of horror can hide anywhere.